I am Teresa Shecker. I am excited to tell you more about my dissertation topic. So my topic is Hearing the Unheard, Using the Voices of Women's Writings to Uncover More Details about the Civilian Experience of the Civil War Siege of Vicksburg. In the introduction of Growing Up Female in America, historian Eve Merriam wrote that female voices have not been so much misrepresented as missing. This is a finding that retired American history professor Sally McMillan in 2018 agreed with, saying that the voices of Southern women remain victims of myth or exaggeration. And that's something that this study will attempt to change. The history of Vicksburg, Mississippi is a very interesting one. Vicksburg was very crucial to Union success in the Civil War. Vicksburg essentially held the Confederacy together, and the sacking of Vicksburg, Mississippi would split the Confederacy in two. Vicksburg held control of the Mississippi River. There were also two coastal railroads that met in Vicksburg, and limiting the use of the river for the Confederates would cause them to not be able to send food, money, troops, and gaining that control for the Union would allow them control of all of those things. It was a very crucial place. If you've ever been to Vicksburg, you know that it is set high above the tops of the Mississippi River. It is very difficult to get from that bluff down to the river, or opposite from the river to the bluff. And that was one thing that helped the Confederates initially, was the idea that it was very difficult to take this terrain. The terrain gave them a particular advantage. They could sit there with their cannons and their guns, and they could completely annihilate any of the Union troops trying to come up or block their path. Yet on May 17th, 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant figured out a turning point. He figured out how to get around all of the east side munitions that were setting them back. However, the setback caused a different technique in the Civil War Siege of Vicksburg. They developed hard war techniques that were intent on making everyone, the entire population of Vicksburg, miserable. This included soldiers and civilians. This included women, children, elderly men, enslaved individuals. It was meant to make them eventually give up and go to Confederate General John Pemberton and say, "We're starving to death. We can't do this anymore. You have to quit." And this was the technique that they used in a 47-day siege against everyone. And so many of the participants there knew, even civilians knew what it meant to be hungry, scared, homeless, and destitute. Yet the civilian voice hasn't been ignored for more traditional tellings of the experience of soldiers, strategies, and battlefield success. This was something that General William Sherman seemed to predict. He actually wrote, "I doubt if history affords a parallel to the deep and bitter enmity of the South, because no one sees them and no one hears them. Yet the voices of women do provide historical discourse so that they can be seen and they can be heard." The main primary source for this study is Mary Loughborough. Mary Loughborough was a 25-year-old during the Siege of Vicksburg. She was a wife to a Confederate general. She was also a mother to a small little girl, 2-year-old little girl named Hope, during the siege. She survived in dugout caves. Her story is one of survival, community, society, and faith. It's a very interesting resource. There are other diarists that wrote during this time, but Mary's diary keeps an almost daily account of what happened. The North American Review in 1864 found that Mary's work afforded an interior view from the southern side of the most interesting episode of the war, and also provided a striking picture of the suffering, exposure, and changes in fortune civilians experienced throughout the Civil War. A lot of people didn't know what had happened in the Siege of Vicksburg and exactly what happened in all of these different battles. And so Mary's voiced it as a testament to that. She initially published her work after she had shared her diary with some friends. She published it under a lady because it was considered improper for a woman's name to appear in print. Yet she did initially add her name. And her diary is absolutely fascinating, and it complements other diaries that were written during that time. You can cross-reference them and see details that truly come to life. Women's writings narrate the truth of these experiences, often in more profound ways than figures known to history. Women's writings uncover previously hidden aspects of civilian life, often missing from traditional narratives, offering a broader and more profound understanding of the campaign's deeper impacts on civilian life. This study, because of those things, will inform those interested in the intersection of war, women, and the impact of war on the household, especially with gender roles. It will inform gender history, Civil War history, social history, and 19th century American history. Before the 1960s, historical discourse regarding women and the Civil War, siege of Vicksburg, or just the Civil War in general, were often written about women and their roles in support of men or as brave participants in war. Ruth Painter in 1953 wrote about Mary Todd Lincoln, but she didn't really write about her as an independent person and what her thoughts were and what her agency was and how she did that. She really wrote about her as wife to Abraham Lincoln and her role as a president's wife. Francis Simpkins and James Patton wrote about the women of the Confederacy, yet they still lacked analysis of women's independent decisions and roles in larger society. The 1960s, though, turned this around a little bit because of the feminist movement. They began to pay more attention to the voices of women. In 1966, Mary Massey produced a comprehensive piece regarding the role of women in the Civil War, yet she only used large repositories for her research. She kind of ignored localized perspectives and more unique materials like diaries and letters, which caused her to kind of miss the individual voices of women. The 1970s and 80s took a more interdisciplinary approach to understanding women in the Civil War. Joan Scott in 1996, wrote on studying women as independent people rather than as a whole, emphasizing that they cannot be understood without proper historical context. And Eugene Fox Genovese in 1988 wrote about plantation households. She blended the history of race and class with gender studies. Although her work is fascinating and very seminal to understanding women and doesn't consider the broad society, it kind of leaves out that middle class of women and poor women who may not have been slaveholders. Bertram Wyatt Brown in 1982 researched the place of honor in society, finding that women's roles concerning kinship and their duties were significant through the work in the home. Although this is relevant, this additionally limits the voice of women regarding agency and independence. Breaking through these boundaries is George Rabel. In 1989, he wrote a work called Civil Wars, Women and the Crisis of Southern Nationalism. He attempted to find the role of women in Southern society. His work went a long way in accomplishing this. However, he used a very widespread sampling method that missed geographical context and the individuality of women. Where previous authors seem to continually miss this mark, Gordon Cotton truly succeeded. Gordon Cotton, if you ask anybody in Vicksburg that understands very much of history, they will tell you that he is an enormous voice in Vicksburg. He took letters and diaries and he completely wrote so many fascinating works on what women said during this time, although his work does lack proper footnotes. So it's kind of hard to track down the sources that he's talking about sometimes. He did help with making a framework for understanding the harrowing details that were experienced by civilians. Gordon Cotton, Terrence Winchell, Sue Burnsmore, and Rebecca Blackwell Drake are all historians that have worked significantly on hearing the voices of women during the Civil War. Although I will say that some of them did only focus on one individual woman. They did offer contextualization and often overlook details of how women's diaries compete with and contribute to the historical interpretation. However, not listening to more than one voice at a time lacks cross-referencing of material, which can build such a deeper understanding of how women really experienced this war and how they sought and found their independence in a besieged city. As said before, this work will attempt to uncover how women maintain roles as wives, homemakers, members of society, members of Christian communities of faith, and how the intersection of war, class, and gender affected these roles. And that will be accomplished through the close reading of women's diaries.